Let's talk more about the realignment. So tell me what you mean within the American context by the realignment, and indeed the new right.
Hmm.
This is nice, easy opening definitions.
It really started. I mean, it's as kind of straightforward as a lot of people think it is. It started with Donald Trump suddenly coming on the stage talking about immigration and trade and the media, and winning margins that Republicans haven't won by in years. A lot of Obama voters in these hollowed out Rust Belt, kind of the cliche states in the middle of the country, places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin. You just saw Donald Trump putting numbers up that shocked people. Michigan. Nobody really saw it coming. And he actually won a lot of former Obama voters that perhaps a 2007 version of Hillary Clinton won in the presidential primaries back in 2007 when she was doing her sort of Rust Belt, working class, blue collar Hillary act. And that really was a wake up call for a lot of people on the right. Some of it's been cynical. Some of it's just been like, hey, we were pimping free market economics for years, and now we see where Trump voters are, and we want to hop on the bandwagon, but we're not actually, when push comes to shove, going to want to do anything but cut taxes, all of that. But what we've seen is the conservative movement, much more than the progressive movement, be willing to have some of these conversations about what as a lot of people in the new right call it, Con Inc., the sort of broader conservative movement, this constellation of nonprofit groups and media organizations. For example, Tucker Carlson just a couple of weeks ago came out and said he thought William F. Buckley had done a lot of evil. That's like 10 years ago. If he had said that as a part of this constellation, you started the Daily Caller, would have been a shock to the system of the conservative movement, but was kind of just, everyone was sort of expects it from Tucker Carlson, who's arguably the most popular person on the new right and in the conservative movement more broadly right now. I mean, when nonprofit organizations have Tucker Carlson speak at a gala, those things are packed. He's probably the most in-demand speaker in the conservative movement right now, a very powerful person who's going after the father of the conservative movement historically, which is William F. Buckley. And it's just expected at this point. That's kind of how serious the shock to the system has been. And obviously, I do think conservative infrastructure still is hulking and has this muscle memory. But, in the span of 4 or 5 years, a lot of this has changed really quickly. And there's been a lot more attention paid to how conservatives can A, appeal to, and B, better serve middle class, working class Americans. What were the blind spots? How can they be corrected now? And this conservative movement, to its credit, was on top of the culture war for decades, but the Republican Party was not. And the conservative movement never convinced the Republican Party successfully to actually represent the cultural interests of its own base. For example, on the abortion issue, one thing that I remember, I was on air when the Dobbs decision came down with my co-host Ryan Grimm, who's on the left. And thing a lot of people on the left get wrong, I was like, there are a bunch of people at the RNC right now who are quaking in their boots, like the official Republican Party, who are terrified and upset at the Supreme Court for overturning Roe. And people who are, in a position to know, people who were at the RNC at that time period have confirmed to me that that's exactly what happened. And it's not surprising to anybody who's followed the conservative movement closely. They just never convinced them to care about the cultural interests of their base. That changed in 2020. So as the economic stuff, trade, immigration was shifting, 2020 comes along and reinvigorates the conservative movement's sort of culture war push. And that's all kind of what's in the mix right now as the right broadly kind of tries to figure out what it should be post-Trump. You see a lot of people on the left, starting to find common ground with people again, like Matt Taibbi, and figures of the left that they never would have found common ground with before. I don't think the left has absorbed those lessons, partially because their muscle memory is almost firmer because they have the media to back them up. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of the weird stuff that's been going on since 2015.
Yeah. So why would establishment conservative figures have been upset by Dobbs? Because there was that dog catching the car problem of like, oh gosh, now we actually have to legislate around this at the state level, or is there some other reason why that would have been actually unwelcome in more establishment circles?
They were totally right. I mean, they were right because their interests are power. Because they, like Mitch McConnell, is somebody who I think almost transparently thinks like this, that if the Republican Party can consolidate power, almost like it's a game, if you can rack up the most points, meaning the most seats and the most success across the country just in elections, then ultimately everything can fall into place. And when your day to day is bogged down in fundraising and whipping votes, I think it's easy to see why he's, after decades in the business, come down with that mindset. But if it's a question of consolidating power, then Dobbs was always going to be a disaster for the Republican Party. And I think we've seen that transpire over the last couple of years. We've seen that illustrated in elections across the last couple of years. And I don't think anybody in the pro-life movement is surprised by that. I think they realized that and knew right away they were going to have a huge lift when it came to messaging and elections. But the sort of Mitch McConnell establishment conservative Republicans at the RNC, when Dobbs came down, were right to say this is a huge impediment going forward, towards our quest for power. And if they were right,
because it motivates a pro-choice lobby to push harder against Republicans in particular seats, or I mean, another question, right? I mean, my view on why abortion is important in American politics in particular is because it's basically indicative of Christianity. The Christian position on abortion is a very clear one. It's also a very unusual one among historically and among other religious traditions. If you're basically if you're restricting abortion, then you are insisting on the government being more Christian, and vice versa, right? So what you're really arguing about is basically whether America should continue to be a Christian state. And what's so interesting, though, in this whole thing is that Donald Trump, who is indicative of the new right and was instrumental in Dobbs, he's not really a Christian figure at all. And he has, my understanding is that he has managed to harness the support of the Christian right, but it's a slightly fragile coalition because it's fairly apparent. I mean, hasn't he refused to answer the question of whether or not he's ever paid for an abortion? Because we all kind of assume the answer is yes.
And he's refusing to answer questions right now about what his policy would be on a 15-week ban or a 6-week ban.
Right.
He says, we'll get to a solution that's good for everyone.
So how is he playing like 4D chess with us? Does he know that actually he can get away with losing the support of, say, evangelical leaders? Or actually is he, my question is basically, what proportion of voters on the right, particularly this kind of populist right MAGA base, actually are Christians and actually care about abortion as indicative of their Christian faith?
Mm-hmm. So it's a super interesting question. I think probably if I had to put a number on it, I would say of the Republican coalition, I would say is like 30% evangelical Christian, so sort of fits the stereotype. It might even be less than that, 20 to 30% evangelical Christian that fits the stereotype of charismatic and political in a way that a lot of the Protestant churches in America aren't, so overtly politicized, but like neatly fits into that. Probably another 20% is Catholic, including a lot of Orthodox Catholics that are very serious about their anti-abortion stances. So I think what he knew, which is really interesting, is that people were so upset about the country in general that if he presented himself as the general bulwark against secular cultural decline, sort of that slide into an unfamiliar secular culture. And this is happening really fast in the West. And, there are people on the left and the right who speak to it, populists on the left and the right who speak to it, whether it's, whether it's in Holland, whether it's in the US, whether it's, in the UK. And I think
Yeah. It's a global vibe.
it's a global vibe. You should write another book
Yeah.
called Global Vibe. But totally, Trump realized that if he could, first and foremost, if he could say his first and foremost priority is stopping that, and gave a little bit to the anti-abortion part on the right, he realized that everyone's priority, more than anything else, basically every person who's anti-abortion is anti-abortion, to your point, because it's a proxy for this broader slide into secularism that terrifies a lot of people, whether they go to church every Sunday or not. If you talk to a lot of people at Trump rallies, they are not people. In fact, my old editor, Tim Carty, wrote a fascinating book called Alienated America, where he posited and then sort of successfully fleshed out this theory that in the Republican primary in 2015 and 2016, where people were more likely to support Donald Trump is where civil society was less prominent. So if you're in this hollowed out,
the bowling alone kind of thesis,
it was totally a follow-up to Bowling Alone, and explicitly so. Yeah. And if you went into some of these, if you went into like Dutch communities in Wisconsin that were really tight-knit, they were supporting Ted Cruz. Mormon communities in Salt Lake City and in Utah, they were supporting Ted Cruz. It was the sort of places in rural America where the pews are empty on Sundays and there are no bowling leagues that were way more likely to support Donald Trump. So if you talk to people at Trump rallies, you'll talk to a lot of people that don't go to church every Sunday for many different reasons. But what they do sort of innately feel is that they're very upset about sort of secular liberals and atheists and all of that, because they recognize that this is about something deeper. So if you sort of appeal and say, we'll get you all the Supreme Court justices you want, you don't have to say, I'm going to have a 6-week ban on abortion federally. And I think Donald Trump, as a populist who came to this from outside the Republican Party, he knows that the pro-life position is broadly unpopular because of conditioning through, Hollywood and all of that over the course of years. And that's what freaked people out about Dobbs, is that it's seen as kind of an icky religious position to be extremely anti-abortion. Donald Trump knew that. So that's where he kind of understood better than a lot of people who had been in Republican politics and the conservative movement for decades, coming from the outside, as somebody who's somebody of popular culture, of Hollywood. He had a hit TV show. He understood that better than I think the right ever did.
It's his amazing talent, isn't it, as a public figure, that he can sort of intuit the popular will.
Totally.
In a way that the vast majority of politicians can't do. And I mean, and to that, do you think that suggests that, so my understanding, although you'll know better than me, is that America has not slid towards secularism anywhere near as quickly as Britain and the rest of Europe, but it is sliding towards secularism nonetheless, and devout Christians tend to be older. With some exceptions, of course, younger generations coming up tend to be less pious. Do you think that Donald Trump might be correctly intuiting a slide on the right in America towards being more post-Christian, and the evangelical wing in particular having less influence?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think you heard a lot of platitudes in the conservative movement in prior decades about how the country was conservative, and there's just when people would talk about the silent majority, it wasn't necessarily with the nuance probably that the silent majority doesn't mean that they're all pious Christians, but it means that they're sort of average people, and average people are increasingly less religious. And Donald Trump knew that because he had a hit TV show that was watched by average people. And there are, back before he was really a politician, there were, pieces written about how popular Celebrity Apprentice and The Apprentice was with the Black community. That this was like something that reached people across the sort of spectrum of the American experience. And I do think there was a bubble. It's almost hard not. I mean, you can't really blame people in the conservative movement for being in a bubble, but they really were. I mean, I guess you can blame them for that. It's sort of their job to, if you say if you say you understand the country, and it's professionally your job to be good at that, then yes, I guess I can blame you. But it's hard, and I think that is what a lot of people lost is. When the Dixie Chicks insulted George W. Bush and people were stomping on their Dixie Chicks CDs or burning them, or radio stations were banning the Dixie Chicks, it sort of neatly fit into this stereotype. And I think Donald Trump at the time probably understood that wasn't a lot of born again Christians who were upset about, from the sort of Christian nationalist perspective, the Dixie Chicks, being disloyal to the greatest country on earth. It was sort of actually this populist outrage at wealthy celebrities trashing the country that is sending poor kids to war overseas, people from their communities to Iraq. And here you have this like rich celebrity she was in London talking trash about the president. And I think if you had talked to Donald Trump at the time about that, he probably would have had a much more nuanced perspective than a lot of people in the sort of professional right would have back in, I think that was 2004.
The culture war is really a class war.
Mm-hmm.